Welcome to another deep dive. This time, you've sent us some really interesting stuff on panic attacks and panic disorder. We've got medical definitions, personal stories, even some Arabic texts, and a psychological questionnaire, too.
Quite a mix, yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to be, unpacking all of this stuff, exploring the symptoms, the causes, and then, of course, looking at treatments. But we're also trying to find those connections, those kind of surprising things that help you understand what's really going on, both physically and mentally. You know what I mean?
And one of those surprising things is that panic attacks can actually happen while you're asleep.
That's right. We're also going to be looking at the connection between panic and vitamin D levels, which I found pretty fascinating. But first, let's make sure we're all on the same page here. There's often a lot of confusion between a panic attack and panic disorder, and that difference is really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. A panic attack is like this sudden wave, like really intense fear. Feels like it just sort of comes out of nowhere. And there's this like feeling of impending doom.
Mm.
It's really important to remember that a panic attack isn't just a mental or emotional thing. It's like a full body physiological response.
Yeah, the sources we have describe some pretty intense physical symptoms. What stood out to you?
Well, you can get a racing heart, pounding heart, sweating, trembling, shortness of breath, chest pain. Sometimes people even feel like they're choking or having a heart attack. There can even be nausea, dizziness, chills, or hot flashes. It's a lot all at once.
Yeah, I can see why someone having those symptoms might think they're having a heart attack or some other medical emergency.
Absolutely. That's a really common thing, and it's important to address. Panic attacks are not life-threatening in themselves, but the fear they cause. Well, that fear is a powerful driver of the disorder.
So, what is it that triggers this intense fear? What's going on?
Well, there's no one simple answer. The sources all point to a lot of different things. You see, our brains have a threat detection system. But in people who get panic attacks, it seems like that system kind of misfires. Their fight or flight response gets triggered when there's no real danger.
Actually, like a false alarm.
Exactly, like a
Yeah.
false alarm. There are genetic factors, of course. And if someone has an anxiety disorder already, they might be more likely to have panic attacks. But then we also have to think about things like stress, external things. And one thing I found really interesting is that learned behaviors can also contribute to panic attacks. Things like catastrophizing.
Catastrophizing.
Yeah. It means
Yeah.
always assuming the worst possible outcome. Like, let's say you have a little heartburn. Someone who catastrophizes might think they're having a heart attack.
And that can, lead to a panic attack?
It can, yeah. One of the articles you sent in, it shares Ted's story. It really brings us to life.
Oh, yeah, Ted. His first panic attack happened when he was visiting his mom in the hospital.
Exactly. He was under a lot of stress, worrying about his mom, rushing to the hospital, and boom, the panic hit. That experience and the fear of having another attack, it really started to affect his life. He started avoiding crowded places, going out less, even affected his work.
Yeah, it makes sense, right? You start associating certain places with panic attacks.
Yeah. But it's really important to remember that everyone's different. What triggers a panic attack in one person might not even bother someone else.
So how do you figure out what your triggers are?
That's where things get tricky. Sometimes you need to really look inward, and sometimes professional help is needed. You might need to look at your personal history, stressful events, or even phobias. It was interesting, though, the Arabic text you sent in mentioned a lot of the same triggers, even though they come from a very different cultural context. Things like stressful life events, school pressures, relationship problems.
It sounds like it's about understanding the person, not just the disorder.
That's really it, yeah. Understanding the person, not just the disorder. And that's really important when we talk about, breaking the cycle of these attacks.
Okay, so how do we break that cycle? What makes these attacks keep coming back for some people?
Well, there's this model developed by a psychologist named David Clark, and it's really helpful here. He talks about maintenance factors that can make panic attacks keep happening.
The maintenance factors.
Yeah. So, like, one of the biggest ones is misinterpreting normal body stuff as signs of danger. Like we were talking about before, that catastrophizing. Let's say your heart starts racing after you climb some stairs. Someone might panic, think they're having a heart attack, when really it's just your body reacting normally to exercise.
So then that fear triggers a panic attack.
Exactly. It's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Another factor is what Clark calls safety behaviors. These are things people do to try to avoid a panic attack, like always having a friend with them when they go out, or or avoiding crowded places altogether.
So they're trying to make a safe space for themselves to, like, prevent attacks.
Yeah, and it's understandable. But these behaviors actually, like, make the fear worse in the long run. Because when you avoid things, you never learn that you can actually cope with them. You just end up proving your fear right.
So it makes the fear stronger.
Exactly. And then there's hypervigilance. That's where you're constantly on edge, looking out for any little threat, any little change in your body. And that just makes your anxiety worse and makes you more likely to have a panic attack.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. It's like a vicious cycle. But the good news is there are effective ways to break it.
Which is where we get to the treatments.
Right. There are psychological treatments and medical ones. And the best approach is, different for everyone. But in almost every source you sent, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, comes up as a really important strategy.
CBT. Could you tell us a little more about what that is?
Yeah. CBT basically helps you change the negative thoughts and behaviors that are causing the panic. We talked about catastrophizing earlier, right? Well, CBT gives you ways to recognize those thoughts and challenge them.
So it's not just about managing the symptoms, but like preventing the panic attacks from happening in the first place.
That's it, yeah. And it's not just talk about your feelings. CBT is very action-oriented. It uses things like exposure therapy.
Exposure therapy? What's that?
It means gradually facing your fears. In a controlled environment, of course. So, say someone has a panic attack in crowded places, they might start by going to a quiet coffee shop with a friend, then maybe a movie, then a concert, slowly building up their tolerance.
So they get used to the things that trigger the panic.
Exactly. And there are breathing exercises and mindfulness techniques that can help manage anxiety right when you're feeling it. When we were talking about Ted, his story really shows how well CBT can work. In the article you sent, he talks about how CBT helped him understand his panic and learn how to cope and start getting his life back.
That's great. It sounds like it gave him back control.
Yeah, and that's something we see a lot in the personal stories you sent in. People feeling empowered to, take control back from the panic.
There was one thing I found really interesting and kind of scary, too. The fact that panic attacks can happen in your sleep. I'd never heard that before.
It is a bit unsettling, isn't it? Waking up in the middle of the night, terrified.
It's like you're not even safe in your own bed. Why does that happen?
It's not totally clear. The sources mention that it could be because of changes in sleep stages or maybe anxiety coming out during sleep.
Interesting. So our brains are still pretty active, even when we're asleep.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Speaking of complex brain activity, I think you found the connection between vitamin D and panic attacks. Pretty surprising, right?
I did. I always thought of vitamin D as, the sunshine vitamin, good for your bones, not something to do with mental health.
Right. It's not an obvious connection. But there's more and more research being done on the link between low vitamin D and anxiety and depression.
So it might not directly cause panic disorder, but it could make the symptoms worse.
That's what their research seems to be suggesting, yeah. It's definitely an area that needs more study, but it's fascinating to see how all these things are connected.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Panic attacks, panic disorder, causes, triggers, treatments. What are the key takeaways here?
Well, it's important to remember that a panic attack is that sudden, intense fear. And panic disorder is the ongoing fear and avoidance that can really mess with your life.
It's the fear that makes it a long-term problem.
Exactly. And that false alarm idea is really useful. Understanding that your brain is misinterpreting signals, triggering the fight or flight response when there's no real danger.
So it's not your fault. It's just your brain getting things wrong.
Yeah. And recognizing those maintenance factors, the things that make the cycle continue. If you can figure out your triggers and challenge the negative thinking, you can start breaking free from the panic.
It's about taking control back.
Exactly. You can manage the panic. Don't let it manage you.
It's interesting, we've been talking about how the brain kind of misinterprets signals and gets stuck in these loops of, panic and fear. Makes you wonder if, our thoughts about anxiety could actually be making it worse.
That's a really good point. We know that what we think can have a huge impact on how we feel, physically and emotionally. So it makes sense that if we change how we think about anxiety, maybe we can change how it feels.
Right. What if instead of seeing anxiety as this monster we need to run from, what if we tried to, understand it?
Yeah. What if we saw it as a signal, a message from our body trying to tell us something? It might be uncomfortable, sure, even painful sometimes. But maybe there's something important in that discomfort.
That's a really different way of looking at it. Instead of trying to get rid of anxiety, we try to learn from it.
And, let's be real, anxiety is a normal human emotion. It's part of what keeps us safe,
Mhm.
from danger and stuff. The problem is when it gets out of control and starts to, like, take over our lives.
Mhm. So it's not about like never feeling anxious, but about, learning to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where all those tools we talked about come in. The CBT, the mindfulness, breathing exercises, or even just, talking to someone.
So like the next time you feel that anxiety coming on, instead of panicking, you could try asking yourself, what is this telling me? What can I learn from this?
I like that. That's a really good strategy. And, remember, you don't have to go through this alone. If
Yeah.
you're dealing with panic attacks or panic disorder, talk to someone, a doctor, a therapist. There's help out there, and you deserve to feel better.
Absolutely. And for those of you who just, love learning about the brain and how it works, keep on diving deep. There's always more to discover.
It's been great exploring this with you.
And that's a wrap for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, knowledge is power.